For what?
Welcome to the Access for Who podcast, a 4-part mini-series that looks to begin a conversation on the digitization of collections of African heritage. This series of discussions attempts to unpack the necessary care and ethics required when seeking to digitize African heritage, particularly in the age of restitution. While digitization is often considered a strategy for future-oriented safekeeping, distribution, and greater engagement, we ask, for who and for what purposes? And are we making decisions about digitization that ensure these objectives are met in ethical, equitable ways? I'm your host, Chao Maina.
And Molemo Moiloa of Open Restitution Africa. Let's talk about access for who, for what.
For what?
4 years ago, Molemo and I met at a conference exploring the future of museums in Africa. Now, several emails, WhatsApp messages, and a ton of Zoom calls later, we started a project called Open Restitution Africa. The project seeks to make data on the restitution of African cultural heritage accessible because we believe that the question of data is so critical to the restitution discussion. How is it critical? We believe, again, that making data accessible creates more public awareness. It enables practitioners to collaborate across countries and regions, and it also facilitates knowledge sharing.
So as part of Open Restitution, we began looking into the question of digital collections and digital restitution. The digital age is advancing rapidly, and museums and cultural institutions are innovating in this direction. While this presents several opportunities, there are also several complexities that we need to be aware of.
We're so excited that you're joining us for this 4-part journey. We see it as a beginning and an invitation to ask ourselves and each other the important questions. We definitely don't have all the answers, but it's really vital that we've begun looking for them.
Exactly. This first episode really sets the grounding. We'll be discussing some definitions, introduce you to some ideas, but also try to understand how the main themes of this podcast really manifest within the context of African heritage and African realities in particular.
We'll be speaking with some very inspiring minds who will help us get on the right footing and really lay the groundwork for the upcoming episodes in which we delve deeper into various aspects of restitution and digital collections.
So speaking of inspiring minds, I think the right place to start is probably with some definitions, right? Understanding where we all kind of come together and understand the same perspective. So first and foremost, we turn to Neema, Iyer.
So my name is Neema Iyer. I'm an artist. I'm a technologist. I'm also the founder of Policy, which is a feminist collective civic tech organization based in Kampala, Uganda. I also run a podcast called Terms and Conditions, which looks at digital cultures across Africa. And yeah, there's more to me, but I will leave it there. So I actually looked it up in terms of digital. So apparently digital comes from digits, which comes from fingers, which comes from counting, which is, when you think about it, it's like, zeros and ones. It's a string of numbers, but I know that that's like the back end. That's how it looks and that's how it works. But for me, I feel like it's this kind of intangible visualization of our physical world. So for me, it feels very intangible. Like you need a device to interact with this other world. So you need your phone or you need a laptop or a computer, any kind of device that, of course, converts those strings into something that we can see and visualize. And I think it's interesting in that it's how, for example, take the example of the floppy disk, right? And that has become the universal symbol for saving. And so that's just how we visualize it now. And it's become a symbol. And there's probably people, many young people walking around who have never seen a physical floppy disk, but they know when they look at that little icon that it means to save. And that's how we have chosen to visualize the word save in a digital space. So, and the other thing I think about digital is, for example, I don't know if you've ever met someone, that you see on Twitter all the time. And this happens to me all the time. Like I'll see people who are online and, they might be super vocal online, and then you meet them in person and they're just a very different person. It's not at all what you expected. They're very quiet. And it also makes me think that people have a different digital manifestation of themselves in online spaces. So for me, it's almost just like a parallel world where anything can happen. Anyone can exist in different forms as well. So maybe it's more in line, I guess, with what Meta is trying to do with the metaverse, but it's just a different parallel world that exists, and it's powered by ones and zeros, which feels like magic.
I think this point that Neema makes about ones and zeros feeling like magic is a really important one, because it points to the kind of way that the digital has become so ubiquitous to our lives, but at the same time remains this slightly mystical thing that we don't fully connect to our everyday lives or become the kind of other version of our everyday lives. But it also highlights a serious limitation of how we've historically approached the digital, which is this kind of space of possibility and magic and wonderfulness. And I think that this kind of, even though we've come to maybe understand it differently, still remains with us. We still see it as this magical space. Don't know what you think.
It's so interesting because I remember when I first encountered computers, this was in high school, and I was taking a class in computer studies. And the way in which we learned about the internet was that it was this space that was kind of like an equalizer and a space that unified everyone and everything. What we believed about the internet at that time was that as long as you were on the internet, we all had equal opportunities. And while this may be true, to some extent, we now are seeing that in very many spaces, the internet in itself has been a space that is replicating a lot of harm, a lot of bias, and a lot of inequality. And it's become very clear that this notion that, digital is neutral and digital is for everyone is false. And yes, there are ways in which this is being unpacked, but not to the extent that we can sit back and look at digital spaces as spaces that serve us all equally. Now, as we take a closer look at digital technologies, we need to unpack them. We need to understand how they affect us as Africans, as people of African descent. And so it's really interesting to have this space that provides so many opportunities and so many inequalities at the same time. But the question for us is, how do we make this magic work? How does this magic of digital technology become more of a blessing instead of a curse?
Absolutely. I love that. How do we make this magic work for us? And we'll obviously discuss this a little bit more over the next couple of episodes. This idea of this space of access and this space of openness that is the digital remains one of the kind of central tenets of digitizing collections in museums and digitizing kind of collections of African heritage. And so it becomes vital that we begin to question this and unpack it a little bit so that, as you say, we can make the magic work for us.
So at this point, we'd really like to unpack the realities of how this plays out, these complexities and biases and nuances that we're talking about. How do they show up in the real world? What are they? Where are they? And especially, what ways do they manifest from an African perspective? And we'll have Neema unpack this for us.
I think looking from, a physical infrastructure point of view, the way digital is right now structured is very exclusive in that many people don't have basic connectivity. So that is the first problem that we run into, is that people just don't have access. The second point is cost. So for example, in Uganda, we have the highest internet costs of, all of East Africa. And that is a major barrier. We also have some pretty regressive laws that make the internet even more expensive and more out of reach for a lot of people. And from our research, we've seen that, generally women tend to earn less. And so they have less income available to spend on things such as data bundles. So they tend to be excluded from these online spaces. So the very infrastructure is set up in a way that it can be exclusive of people who are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, who are women, who are marginalized in any other way, that they cannot afford to be in this digital space. And that's very concerning because a lot of our lives are moving into this parallel digital space. And what does it mean for all these people who get left behind from that conversation? And then if we go more to the intangible, so in terms of the content that is online, most of it is in, I would say, colonial languages. So a lot of content is in English, it's in Spanish, French. Now more so, there's more content in, for example, Mandarin and Hindi. Like that has come in the past few years. But that remains a major barrier in how people can basically use the internet. So if you log onto a platform and all the instructions are in English or, French or Spanish, that basically serves to exclude you from those kinds of platforms. And that really, like, English is a lingua franca of the whole world, but especially it has been off the internet. So it's quite exclusionary in that way.
This question on infrastructure is a really interesting point because we often talk about access from the perspective that accessibility is uniform for everyone. And the ways in which Neema speaks to both the physical infrastructure and also crucially the financial infrastructure that you need to get data is really important in this discussion within the African context, One of the things that we've talked about between Molemo and I are the parallels between information that sits on the internet and information that doesn't sit on the internet. And just because something is not on the internet doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And so this brings forth the notion that the internet is a place where everything exists. And if you fall outside those realms or boundaries, then you're not legitimate. I'm really interested by the ways in which Neema speaks to this in a way,
Yeah, in a sense, I think you can almost speak to sort of two sides of the same coin in what Neema references. So on the one hand is this physical access, which is this kind of financial device, data, even like the speed of internet kind of concern, which is like physical access. And on the other side is a more kind of conceptual or epistemic access, which is this question of things like language or other kinds of more conceptual relationships to this place called the internet, that when you don't have physical access, even the idea of how you engage with the internet shifts, and can be really difficult to even imagine connecting with. And I think that part of what Neema is pointing to is the fact that the internet in many ways isn't a place for Africans, hasn't necessarily been made for Africans, hasn't necessarily been made for most of the world, to be honest. As she points, like English is the lingua franca of the internet. And that has a particular impact in how you relate to the internet, right? And how you use it and what it's for, particularly as, I suppose, the physical access question is such a massive one on the African continent. So even though we have quite a lot of mobile internet use, I think we have one of the highest numbers of like mobile internet users in the world because so many Africans have more than one phone. But that's quite limited to like people in the cities, or it's quite limited to certain sort of class access, gender access. And the way that you use the internet from your mobile is also very specific to certain kinds of services and platforms, right? I think someone like Kola really speaks to some of these relationships between the kind of physical access question and then the epistemic access question.
My name is Odumosu. I am a linguist. That's the first thing that comes to mind when I think of what I do. But I'm also a creative writer, and I have done some work in teaching, some journalism in the past. But my focus, my attention over the last decade or so has been in finding ways to improve the presence of African languages in technology. Just finding ways to help African language survive and to deal with the current century. I'll take you back to 2000 when I first got into university. I was a first-year student. A year later, I think I got my first computer, which was kind of a second-hand computer I was able to buy somewhere. And I remember trying to write my name on the system and having it underlined in Microsoft Word. It still does it now, actually, for things that the software doesn't recognize as English. And it does that because English was the basis for the software. And it's an American software company. Computers were things made, by Microsoft and Apple, everybody was expected to use and fit in it. So you would write, a paragraph, and because there's a Yoruba name there or an Igbo name, it underlines it. Everything else looks, everything else is normal. But then I also realized another thing, that when I was writing other Yoruba expressions, like because Yoruba is a tone language, so we use diacritics, which are marks on top of the vowels or under the vowels to show either vowel quality or tone. So a word like owo is written differently from owo, is written differently from owo, etc. Those tone marks differentiate these things, and you can say something totally different if you don't properly mark it when you write it. So I realized that this tool to mark didn't exist in Microsoft Word at all. And many of my professors who wanted to write in Nigerian languages often had to buy softwares to use. Sometimes they didn't have it. Some languages don't have scripts, or some languages don't have the scripts incorporated into Unicode, which is the computer system that powers the typing of languages online. So I started realizing that without us having a presence there on the internet, we were being excluded gradually. Most of the languages on the internet were in English, Wikipedia entries were in English, Google searches were in English. If you search for something in Yoruba, if you didn't put the marks, you wouldn't get the right results. Sometimes you put the marks, you didn't get them either.
Kola, speaking from the perspective of a linguist, really, I think, unpacks some of these complexities around epistemic access, but also how, your first relationship with the digital is saying that you're wrong somehow. This idea of your name being underlined. I mean, we've all experienced that. And I think it's a really useful way of sort of just marking your initial experience with even the most basic program like Microsoft Word. And even though he's coming from more of a literary background, I think really starts to point to the kinds of limitations of the internet more broadly, and how African knowledge systems, heritage, histories fit into it or don't, right? And I think Kola has developed some really interesting strategies of how to deal with this, and we'll definitely come back to those just now, but also later on in the episodes of this podcast. But what I think is really important that he points to here is just these kind of, for lack of a better word, quirks in the system that make the digital and digitizing incredibly difficult and really quite unreliable within the space of the kind of connection of African heritage and the digital space.
It's really vital that we begin to see these things as not just small things, and the ways in which you can keep hearing, for instance, over and over again, but you're wrong, the computer can't understand this or that. But when it's happening, when you're writing something, you tend to think that it's insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But really, when we see this at a larger scale, what kind of implications does it have when these little quirks, as you mentioned, Molemo, when they build up? And many of us know the stories of machine learning or artificial intelligence being based on large quantities of problematic data. More and more, we've seen this. I think there's a whole Netflix show on it, actually. And therefore, we are building data sets. We're building systems out of data that is problematic, sexist, racist, and biased. And what happens when these systems become embedded in everyday life, Now, within the heritage space and the museum space, and as people who work in arts and culture, we are saying that we're not immune to this. And so much of the knowledge on African history, the written works on Africa that is now being turned into digitized data is still subjected to this very long, drawn-out process of the inaccuracies, the gaps, the limitations, the racism that we are seeing in other data sets as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. As you say, it can feel like small little quirks, but in the bigger scheme of things, when we start to look at it at scale, we really start to see the implications. And I think what's so important about what you're saying is we also have to recognize our role in kind of contributing to that broader scale of data, and the potential results that emerge out of the way our technologies are shifting, and how Africans play a role in kind of what goes in, but then are also quite affected by what comes out. Kola also speaks to this a bit. He kind of speaks to this phrase, which I think comes from the machine learning space and the kind of tech space of garbage in, garbage out.
So one of the things we created at the beginning was a free tone marking software which people could download and use to be able to write in Yoruba, because we believe that writing in Yoruba properly with the markings is a very important way of writing language. In any case, it's also helped the translation machines that were eventually developed, because if it's called garbage in, garbage out, if we have enough properly written text on the internet, then there will be proper translation outputs when the machines gather those texts and use them.
It's very interesting to look at it from the perspective of knowledge systems. And we are so excited to be joined by Temi Odumosu, who is a historian and an academic. She speaks to the ways in which this limited field of knowledge sharing according to particular systems and according to particular rules, how it affects how we create knowledge and how we share knowledge. When we speak about African history in particular, what are the silences that we have and the gaps that we have? And furthermore, what happens when these silences are being replicated over and over again within the digital sphere?
I'm an art historian by training, and I've spent a long time sort of embroiled in the archives of slavery and colonialism. But one of the things I learned whilst being there in the physical archives and in the process of my research transforming as things became more readily available online is the extent to which the things that were unfinished and unprocessed, the emotions, the affects, the ways in which histories had not been told fully, partially fragmented, that there were many silences in the archive, as Michel Rolfe-Trio reminds us, the Haitian historian. And so there are all of these gaps, silences, omissions, places of deep pain, trauma, ambiguity in a confrontation with the original archive, if you can call it, all the evidential documents that came direct from planters, records, and so on. And then realizing that that unfinishedness kind of migrated when institutions decided to open up collections, make them more readily available, primarily in the name of accessibility.
I really, really love this point that Temi brings up when she speaks in the name of accessibility, quote unquote. Because what does it mean to access something that is inherently flawed, to reproduce it over and over again? And, this whole podcast is about challenging and exploring notions around access. For me, as a historian, this is one of my favorite parts because she speaks very beautifully to the kind of unfinished nature of archives. That even when they're whole, when you walk into an archive or a library and you encounter a record, it in itself is an unfinished record of the past. And sometimes these archives are reproducing the perspective of the people who created them, and therefore are traumatic in many ways, are biased in many ways. And now Temi has spent a lot of time working with records relating particularly to the periods of slavery. And what she asks is that when we come to this material, as Africans, as people who are directly connected to such traumatic past, we can't really separate what happens when we encounter them, whether they're physical or digital. The digital still carries with it the same affects as the physical records.
Absolutely. I mean, you know that this just speaks so much to many of the things that I've been concerned with ever since I first sort of stepped into a European museum's African collection, and the book of records of the different objects was opened in front of me, and I realized it was pretty much empty. It was such a stark shock for me to see that, the average page, particularly sort of in the colonial period when museums were collecting en masse at a speed they could barely keep up with, the average page of this record book has a drawing of the object, the name of the person who brought it in, so usually a white male collector, maybe the name of the people who it was collected from, but sometimes that would just be replaced with some racial slur instead. And then some measurements of the size, a little bit about the material it's made of, and a number. And I mean, that's not information, right? That's information about a museum. That's not an information about an object, an artifact. It's not an information about a people. It's not information about a ritual, a practice, a life. And so recognizing that that's the information they have. And then when they're digitizing these collections, they're literally repeating the same absences, the same silences, the same information that they claim is about the object, but is actually much more about Western collecting and museum practice than it is about any African history, right?
So true. And we talk about digital collections in the next episode, and I'm excited to get to it. But, this point on the replication of violence is something that you and I have both encountered as practitioners, just traveling around the world and around Africa and seeing the kind of ways in which collections are described, particularly colonial collections, and we have several examples of this, can be really traumatizing. And it's interesting to me because you go to these collections, looking for answers, but you actually end up leaving with more questions. And I'm sure you can relate to that as well.
Absolutely. And I think Temi speaks to this really well when she refers to the kind of promise of abundance. But as you say, we're just left with a lot more questions.
And I think digitization brought with it a kind of promise of abundance. And it's like, we can share more from what is in the basement. And we can also allow people to kind of engage with it in a much more diverse way. Because, of course, when you put things online, things become networked, right? They have a social kind of life. Of course, what it also means, especially in terms of institutional mindset, is that there is a kind of how would I describe it? A kind of strange gap. So on the one hand, it's digitization, sharing cultural heritage for all. On the other hand, it's digitization so that now that it's online, we don't have to think about it too much. We don't have to think about the collections too much. We can allow for things to just do things in the world, and we can carry on with the business of looking after originals.
I think that Temi's point around getting on with the originals is a vital one here, because often within the space of how African heritage is being digitized, and particularly within the museum and sort of archive space, this digital part of the work is done as a kind of extra, as something of an aside, that is intended to create more access, is intended to ensure a kind of keeping up with the futuristic needs of any institution and not getting left behind by technology. But it's not necessarily kind of a central practice in and of itself. I think both of us have found this in our experience with museums. And so what you often have is people who are really concerned with the originals engaging in a digitization process that is seen as a blank and neutral kind of copy, secondary to the authenticity of an original object. But in doing so, I often feel like there isn't enough of a recognition and expertise, or even just a study and understanding of the complexity of this whole new beast that you're producing in the digital realm.
And too often this means that people who are dealing with originals are also expected to take on the digital realm. And what we are seeing with museums and this whole rush to digitize is that the staff and the people who take care of the originals, the curators, the researchers, the conservators, are expected to oversee the digitization process in itself with very little support and awareness on what the technology entails, what it could do, and the potential and the damages that it could bring. And so what we're seeing here is really a problem of two worlds communicating with each other. Because as a techie myself and understanding the ways in which data can seem the same. From a tech perspective, whether it's data on agriculture, data on culture, data on money, it can seem like the same thing. Data is data, if you look at it from that perspective. But what damage does it bring when this is not challenged from a heritage point of view? Now, it's not all gloom and doom. There are some people who are working on strategies for enabling ways that digital technology can support African needs and also African heritage needs, because this is also a complex issue on its own. I speak to this a lot in my work because I believe that African heritage and the complexities that we have faced as a people in accessing heritage, in coming to our heritage, these complexities still need to be accounted for when we digitize and when we talk about digital collections. And so for me, digitization is not just an opportunity to provide access, it's a way of completely reimagining and radically almost reimagining what access actually means.
And one thing that I feel often that happens is we are very clear on what we don't want, right? We don't want AI systems that are biased against us, or we don't want an internet that's exclusive, or we don't want online violence. But I think where we struggle is, okay, what exactly do we want?
I think what Neema really points to in this sort of catch-22 situation is the need to begin to imagine what our alternatives can be and what can be created. So we need to be able to understand the limitations of the technology we have and recognize that we cannot simply assume that we're not replicating long-held social injustices, but also not leave technology in that space and sort of give up on it, I suppose, but rather recognize that if dealt with in thoughtful and careful and brave ways, we might be able to move beyond these kinds of limitations. Someone like Kola, who we heard from before, really challenges us to think through ways we can make this technology bend to our will, make this magic work for us, as you said, Chao, with an example of a project he's developed over many years, which looks to address a social concern, first and foremost, for African practitioners and their heritage, but also, I think really importantly, begins to build data frameworks and infrastructures that have potential for future needs as well.
YorubaName.com dictionary is an open source project, by which we mean that all the code is available on GitHub and people can use it to create their own project. But even the database itself, the Yoruba names, from the very beginning, I've known that names, I don't own it. It doesn't belong to me specifically. It belongs to the culture, it belongs to the people, which was why we made it open crowdsourced as well, by which I mean that all the names there are editable. Anybody who finds a name and finds a meaning can click on a button and say, well, this name is wrong, or the meaning is not complete, or there's a story I have about my name that I think you might be interested in, and then can put it there, and then we can add it so more people can see it. One of the things we also hope to do is to incorporate social media elements so people can have discussions on their names and maybe share stories and stuff like that. So when we're working with African cultural traditions, legacies and things like this of cultural value, it's important to note that you don't own it. What we're trying to do really is to facilitate access to other people, to have access to it, especially Africans who own this cultural heritage. There are people I've spoken to who don't know the meaning of their names, but their own names, they never asked their parents, or the parents passed away or whatever, but they go to the dictionary and they find somebody who has a similar name that has a story that can help them connect to their own heritage, which is exactly what my plan was at the beginning, just to create a space, just like Google has done for most of humanity, a space or Facebook or Twitter, where we can find a way to collaborate and share knowledge in a space that is trustworthy, and find ways to connect with each other through our cultural heritage.
Another group that is reimagining ways of using the digital for African heritage, for African data, is the Women's History Museum of Zambia. Now, Molemo and I are huge fans of the work that founders Samba and Mulenga are doing. They're working with digital museum collections to reconnect communities with their heritage. and using this point of reconnection essentially as a methodology for research into what makes digital forms accessible for Africans and people of African descent who want to encounter their history online. Mulenga shares how they do this.
Part of the workshop and the workshopping that we were doing with the villages was to find out from them how to design the platform so they can access it. Mm-hmm. So we were also asking them about how many devices they have in the village. What is the connectivity? Things like that. What is the literacy rate in the village? If they have to put information onto the platform, who can do it? And the people in the village actually came up with their own solutions, which was really gratifying because sometimes we tend to think that, oh, this is impossible. But the people themselves who appreciated this and saw the idea as something that they could actually jump onto and be participants in, they came up with their own solutions on how they can use that platform as people in the village with limited devices or limited connectivity, they all limited literacy. So they gave us those ideas as well. Like, okay, if we are going to use this from this village, which has only so many devices and so much connectivity, we will do it like this. So we also wanted to explore that aspect of digital restitution, if you want that. Is it possible? And, in the African sense, is it, because sometimes I think we Africans sometimes limit ourselves by just thinking, well, we don't have that much coverage, people don't have this, people don't, so it won't, but sometimes the solutions are actually with the people themselves who you are working with. And we got a lot of solutions,
And so what Sam and Mulenga are doing at the Women's History Museum really shows us that there are ways of addressing the limitations. Because if we stop at the limitations themselves, then we are ignoring the reality that this information, this data is still very, very vital to us. This idea that we have a lot of our own solutions is a very powerful one. It enables us to begin approaching technical questions from a sense of ownership, which is very important. How does technology intersect with our capacities, with our infrastructure, with our knowledge? This is what Neema Iyer called conceptualizing our own data futures. I love it. For Kola, some of this might live within our own heritage to begin with.
So I don't know if I have the direct answers to the question, but I'm hoping that more of us think specifically, yes, outside of the colonial spaces, using our indigenous knowledges. IFA is one of them, which is a binary, kind of corpus. Many people say it's a source of many things that eventually became computer systems. But we never developed it into that system. To be fair, we had it, and other people learned from it and then used it to create stuff. So the question is, what do we do with the knowledge we have that has not yet been commodified? And how do we make sure they can work for us to better encode our knowledge systems, better empower us to be able to deal with the realities of modern existence, and better enhance our way of life? I don't have the answer, but I am looking as well.
In this amazing statement, Kola refers to the IFA divination systems, which, for those of us less familiar with them, are largely understood to be one of the earliest binary code systems that mirror some elements of today's computing. For many, and as Kola argues here, IFA divination points to just one of the many ways Africans might source knowledge from existing heritage. As you said, Chao, having the knowledge ourselves and knowing what to do ourselves, maybe from contemporary knowledges, but also from historical and traditional ones such as IFA, to define our own data futures. Part of what we will do over the next couple of episodes is to attempt to explore this, to really try to unpack what knowledge we do have, what is available to us, to reimagine the way that so far things have been moving, and to try and find strategies for kind of better ways of doing it in the future.
I mean, there is something liberatory about the digital when it's removed conceptually from either the Internet of Things, so apps, right? Or whether it's removed from these kind of clunky ways in which the digital space is just seen as a way to make things happen faster, quicker, more efficiently, and with less human interaction. Because that's also the way that the digital is kind of mobilized in our lives. But I also see it as, I see it as a space of potential, also in its capacity to reformulate, shift forms very quickly. I mean, now I'm thinking of this in terms of art and aesthetic practices, and also thinking generatively with glitches and errors. How do glitches and errors intervene in ways that are actually generative, right? So that a mistake online actually takes you elsewhere. Like, there's something about, if you're a curious person, the digital space is like it's like an endless kind of, space of treasures and like places where you can travel down roads and take left turns that maybe you wouldn't do in your actual life, but you can do online because the user interface is so much easier. I think about the ways in which, within the space of 10 years, I mean, we have grandparents who are on WhatsApp sharing the strangest things, and you're like, whoa, right, that wouldn't have happened a decade ago, right? They'd be like, what is this thing? What is this WhatsApp? They're taking it, they're reformulating it, they're re-educating us about culture, they're sending, visual to, and this is, the interesting thing is how WhatsApp and Twitter and all these other places are being used to distribute stories, colonial stories, but also family stories in a new way to gather people around the things that have been in the base. And then you take a quick photograph, you send it to the WhatsApp group. Okay, so now everybody has a copy and now we're looking at it. Now we're thinking about the family history together in a new way. So I think there's something about, we have to continuously think about what more speed and more data means in terms of the nervous system. That said, I think there's also something interesting that it does in terms of connecting people and keeping people creative and thinking about clever ways of sharing and coming together.
We are going to try to be honest and critical and upfront about the problematic ways that African heritage is being addressed in the digital realm. But we also really want to invite you to imagine together with us, to explore, to ask questions, to learn from committed, clever people doing really amazing work. Because when we ask access for who, for what, we begin a journey of repairing old wounds, of deep care for our long dismissed histories, of creating anew. So please, join us, continue with us on this journey, and follow us for the upcoming episodes. This podcast is brought to you by Open Restitution Africa, a collaboration between African Digital Heritage and Andani.Africa. The podcast is produced by Chao Maina and Molemo Moiloa, with Pumzile Nomboso Twala and Letabolaka Gumede on research. Thank you to Josh Chiundiza for the music, Karugu Maina on design, and Annelien van Heembeek on editing.
The podcast was made possible by 99 Questions at the Stiftung Humboldt Forum in Berliner Schloss. This podcast is also available in zine form in French and German at www.openrestitution.africa and www.humboldtforum.org. Thank you for joining us.